For families who have waited years for justice, the resolution of cold cases offers closure. These long overdue resolutions are being accelerated by recent advancements in DNA evidence analysis. Unfortunately, solving a murder case also necessitates revisiting the distressing memories connected to these murders. However, for the loved ones of murder victims whose deaths had since been a mystery, learning the whole truth of what transpired might bring comfort. In today's video, we want to discuss 5 Alabama cold cases that eventually saw their big breaks. This case takes us to Heflin, Alabama. In 2002, Heflin was a small town which has a population of less than 3,500 people and a total area of just 16.31 square miles. Back then, everyone pretty much knew everyone, and when a triple homicide occurred in a place like Heflin, it shook the very core of the community and left behind aftershocks that may still be felt today, particularly when the victims were a young pregnant woman and her 6-year-old son. Monica Pritchett Rollins was a 23-year-old mother of 2 boys named Dalton and Aaron, who were 6 years old and 2 years old respectively. Before her murder, Monica was also expecting the birth of her 3rd son in a few weeks. After she and Jeremy Rollins, Dalton and Aaron's father and her high school lover, made the decision to separate and file for divorce, Monica and the boys moved into their Sugar Hill Road home in late 2001. On Friday, September 13, 2002, Donald Pritchett, Monica's father, had been looking forward to Monica and the boys' arrival at his Anniston house so he could finally give Dalton his gift, a colt Dalton had named Mojave. When they finally arrived, they spent the evening talking, eating, and riding horses before Monica and the boys returned to their Heflin house at around 8:30 p.m. with the intention of returning later that weekend. But after the weekend had passed with no further communication from Monica, a family member made the decision to go see if everything was well with her and the kids. Nothing could have prepared them for what they discovered when they arrived at Monica's mobile home around 10:45 a.m. on September 16, 2002. Monica and her first son, Dalton, had been cruelly killed in their own house. According to autopsy results, they died as a result of multiple stab wounds they sustained somewhere over the weekend. Because of the assault, Monica went into labor. Her unborn child was later discovered dead and only partially delivered. Aaron, her 2-year-old son, was discovered hidden in a closet, inside the house alive and unhurt. Around 6 p.m. on the same day, Jeremy Rollins left Southwire after completing a 12-hour shift. He found out about the killings of his ex-wife and his oldest son a few hours later when the police requested him to report to the station. As the investigation progressed, officials claimed that Jeremy was not a potential suspect and that he cooperated with the inquiry the entire time. The detectives did all they could to find the culprit at the time, but there were no tangible leads. At the time of the murder, DNA, fingerprints, and other types of evidence had been gathered at the crime scene and transferred to the Alabama Department of Forensic Science for examination. Unfortunately, due to budgetary restrictions, the forensic department experienced severe backlog problems at the time of the killings, which caused a delay in processing. The case, however, went cold for decades until January 2021 when investigators reopened the case. They re-interviewed 60 people and resubmitted a cigarette butt found at the crime scene to the forensic lab for DNA testing. After a thorough analysis, investigators linked the evidence at the crime scene to Lewis Landon Spivey. Spivey, who is now 36 years old, was 18 when he allegedly killed Monica and Dalton. He was romantically involved with Monica. After the murders, in 2010, Lewis Spivey was imprisoned in Florida for 15 years due to a separate robbery and severe assault case from Bay County. Investigators visited him in prison for an interview. On June 26, 2023, Lewis Landon Spivey confessed to the killings of Monica Rollins and Dalton Rollins. He allegedly offered officials a complete confession by describing the incident and accepting sole responsibility for the killings. Finally, after 21 years, Lewis Spivey was taken into custody by Health and Police Department after his release from a Florida prison. In 1999, 17-years-old J.B. Beasley and Tracy Holt were best friends. They were incoming seniors at Northview High School in Dothan, Alabama. The girls, who lived in Dothan, Alabama, had decided to travel to Headland for JB's birthday celebration on the 31st of July, 1999. They loaded up in JB's 1993 black Mazda at around 10 p.m. and headed out. However, they soon got lost in Ozark, which is roughly 20 miles from their house. At around 10:30 p.m., the girls halted at a gas station to ask for directions because they couldn't decide where to go. They also used the gas station's payphone and appeared to have a better understanding of where they needed to go after speaking to some friends. However, an hour later, they were still in the dark and far from where the birthday celebration was to take place. They made another stop, this time at a different store that had a payphone. Tracy then called her mother, Carol Roberts, and explained that they were lost. She soon added that they were returning home. Sadly, Carol never saw her daughter or her best friend ever again. The next morning at about 5 a.m., Carol noticed her daughter hadn't returned home. She knew something was wrong because Tracy was never late. When it was 8 o'clock and Tracy had not yet returned, Carol called the Dothan Police Department to report her missing. Authorities got to work and discovered JB's car that day. It had been parked on Herring Avenue in Ozark, with the tank empty, despite it being filled the previous day. The car's driver's side window was rolled down a few inches, and the doors were unlocked. A handprint on top of the trunk gave investigators an eerie clue as to what might have happened. The police opened the trunk and discovered JB and Tracy in it. They both had been killed by a gun. Although dressed, both teenagers were strangely dirty. Semen was discovered on the scene, which allowed detectives to obtain a DNA sample from the offender. Because both girls still had their purses and valuables, authorities were able to rule out robbery as a possible motive. The only item missing from the car was JB's keychain, which held the car keys. It was unclear to investigators if JB and Tracy were killed in the trunk or somewhere else. On September 1st, 1999, a month after the girls were discovered, a man named Johnny William Barentine walked into the Ozark Police Department to give his testimony of what he thought might have happened to the girls. According to him, on the 31st of July, 1999, he had gone to the grocery store to purchase milk for his 2-year-old son, just about the same time Tracy contacted her mother from the Big Little store. On his way back home, his car got hit by a black truck with Dothan license plates close to Herring Avenue. He claimed to have seen the truck speed away from the crime scene where the girls were discovered. The investigators interviewed Johnny for 4 hours, and during those times he changed his testimony at least 5 times. Johnny at a point placed himself at the crime scene. After much inconsistencies in his testimony, the police eventually filed 2 murder charges against him. Johnny was sentenced to death. However, he kept on asserting his innocence and said he had just made up the stories to get the reward money. In the year 2000, the grand jury decided not to indict Johnny. Upon discovering that his DNA did not match the semen sample discovered at the crime scene, he was no longer treated as a suspect. Over the years, a number of additional leads turned out to be false, but the detectives never gave up looking for a DNA match. The authorities have looked into a lot of suspects throughout the years. They conducted hundreds of interviews and collected DNA samples from quite a number of people, but there was no luck. On the 20th anniversary of the girls, investigators reopened the case and decided to use a new approach. They entered the evidence at the crime scene to a public genealogy database in March 2019 and soon got a connection. Officials soon announced the arrest of 45-year-old Coley Lewis McCraney. McCraney, who had been in Dothan all along, was charged with 5 counts of capital murder and 1 count of first-degree rape. The community and Marlos Walker, the current chief of the Ozark Police Department, were astonished by how the investigation turned out. Chief Walker actually attended school with McCraney. They found it hard to believe that he could be accountable for such a heinous deed. Back in 1999, McCraney would have been 25 years old, divorced from his first wife, and was involved in an ongoing paternity lawsuit. Ironically, the day before the killings, the judge had actually mandated that he submit a DNA test. Records show that he never followed the directive. McCraney had never been arrested before, and he was never considered a suspect during the initial investigation in 1999. He got remarried in 2001, and at the time of his arrest, he was a bishop, motivational speaker, and working for the Lord. After his trial in April 2023, Coley McCraney, who is now 49 years old, was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The young son of a woman named Yvonne Johnson was playing behind their Brookhaven Trailer Park house on Hearst Street in Opelika, Alabama on the afternoon of January 28, 2012, when he discovered a small human skull. Startled, the little boy ran inside to inform his mother, who then dialed 911. In a short period of time, authorities reached the location and retrieved the skull. They then spread out into the woods and discovered more human remains. Also, a pink long-sleeved shirt with heart buttons and ruffles was found. This was discovered next to a brook, but it was unclear to the investigators whether it was associated with the human remains. Following forensic examination, it was discovered that the bones belonged to an African American girl between the ages of 4 and 7. In line with malnutrition, the results also showed that the young girl's bones were underdeveloped. She had an obvious abnormality to her left eye, which was presumably brought on by abuse, and there were indications that she had been physically assaulted before her death. The young girl suffered fractures to her ribs, shoulders, limbs, legs, and skull. She suffered more than 15 separate fractures from blunt force trauma in total. All these injuries had been incurred before she passed away. The girl's DNA was run through the missing person database, but no matches were found. The police soon appealed to the public for information. Unfortunately, there were very few tips, and after just 4 months, the case was closed. The unnamed youngster was later referred to as Opelika Jane Doe, or Juvenile Jane Doe. In an effort to get some urgently needed information, federal agents at the FBI office in Quantico, Virginia, used forensic imaging equipment to create a sketch of what the young girl may have looked like while still alive. The composite sketch was made public by the detectives. They had billboards up around the southeast and circulated the flyers widely online, urging anyone who may identify the young child to get in touch immediately. Investigators soon determined that Opelika Jane Doe had died between 2010 and 2012. However, after a former Vacation Bible School instructor at the Greater Peace Church in Opelika came across the sketch, she gave investigators a picture from 2011. She thought that Opelika Jane Doe was in the photos. They made public the church photos, which showed the young child with a defect in her left eye. She had black hair that was fashioned in little, tight curls and was medium in length. The general population was prompted to reflect on the past and to examine whether they knew a little girl who attended the Bible school. According to them, Opelika Jane Doe usually appeared to have been slightly unkempt and wearing filthy clothes. She was described by the teacher as being quiet, solitary, and not particularly social with the other kids at the Bible school. Authorities tried to find her name in churches and schools, but they found nothing. They soon transferred Opelika Jane Doe's remains to the University of South Florida's Forensic Anthropology for isotope analyses after the images were made public. She was identified as being from the southeastern region of the country, most likely Alabama or nearby states. With no lead, the case went cold for 10 years. In 2022, detectives expanded their search for answers outside Alabama. They went to other states where the girl might have lived before her murder. They questioned residents and interviewed quite a number of people, showing them Opelika Jane Doe's possible photos to see if they could identify her. Luckily, there was a significant breakthrough in the investigation when authorities discovered 50-year-old Lamar Vickerstaff Jr. to be Opelika Jane Doe's father. Lamar Vickerstaff was born and raised in Opelika, but throughout his time in the Navy, he resided in a number of locations. He finally settled at Naval Station Mayport in Jacksonville. When investigators met with him at the naval installation to break the news of his daughter's death, he steadfastly refused to identify his daughter. His wife, Ruth Vickerstaff, was questioned by investigators, and she admitted she had no idea who his daughter was or who she might have been. She and Vickerstaff had tied the knot in 2006. The detectives did further investigation and discovered Opelika Jane Doe's real mother, who was 37-year-old Sherry Wiggins. Sherry disclosed to the police that in January 2006, she had given birth to a girl who went by the name of Amore Jovia Wiggins. However, after her visitation privileges were revoked, her ex-husband Vickerstaff and his wife were granted physical and legal custody of her daughter in 2009. Sherry Wiggins was able to provide investigators evidence that she had been paying Vickerstaff child support since 2009. According to investigators who looked through pediatric and school records in the communities where the vicar staffs resided, Amore Wiggins was never enrolled in school and was never reported missing. In January 2023, DNA testing made it clear that Opelika Jane Doe was actually Amore Jova Wiggins. On January 17th, Vicar Staff Lamar and his wife Ruth were both taken into custody. Ruth was charged with failing to report a missing child, while Vicar Staff was charged with felony murder and failure to report a missing child. Finally, after 11 years, Amore Wiggins' identity was finally buried with her. On February 27th, 2023, hundreds of residents of Opelika and investigators came to honor her life. Detective Alfred White of the Opelika Police Department remarked, "We can finally put the right name and right face to her, and we don't have to call her Jane Doe anymore." Sherry, Amore's mother, was also present. In her words, she heartbreakingly said to her late daughter, "I didn't want you to have it hard, so I let your tiny hand go, thinking you'd be playing in a big backyard." On a cold morning on November 15, 2015, around 11:30 a.m., Hale and his wife, who lived on Farley Lane in Lillian, Alabama, discovered a startling sight on their private driveway. They noticed a strange car that had been there the first time they came out around 7:30 a.m. On seeing the car again, they had a bad feeling about it and decided to check it out. When they peered into the car's windows, they saw the body of a young man who appeared to have been shot to death at the back of the seat. Hale immediately dialed 911, and the Baldwin County Sheriff's Office arrived at the scene and identified the individual as 22 years old Devin Deshawn Kennedy from Pensacola, Florida. His mother, Tammy Sims, had reported him missing a day before. Further investigations revealed that Devin had a history of run-ins with law enforcement in relation to drug charges. When Tammy Sims got the news of her son's murder, she was devastated. In an interview, she described Devin Kennedy as a determined young man who sought a better life for himself and his family. He was also a devoted father and a loving son. According to Sims, her son always wanted to run his own business. He always mentioned starting a restaurant and investing in real estate. Sadly, Devin's dream was cut short and his life taken away from his 2-year-old daughter. Devin was working and attending college the day he was killed. His mother knew something was wrong when he didn't come home or answer his phone calls. Tammy Sims sought justice for her son for many years, pleading with the public to put themselves in her shoes and say something if they knew anything. Sadly, the case was opened, but gradually became cold. Police also investigated the case at the time and identified a few people of interest, but they did not have any solid evidence to link them directly and charge them with the crime. For 8 years, Devin Deshawn Kennedy's case file stayed cold on the Baldwin County Sheriff's shelves. In April 2023, the Baldwin County Sheriff's Office announced the arrest of 32-year-old Deputy Darnell Herring, who has been charged with the murder of Devin Deshawn Kennedy. According to the police, they earlier received information that eventually led to the arrest of Deputy Herring. They, however, never mentioned what information it was. According to detectives, Devin and Herring may have known one another, and the motive for murder was robbery. Herring had shot Devin elsewhere and left him off at Lillian, Alabama. Deputy Herring's first court appearance took place Friday afternoon on the 21st of April, 2023. He informed the judge that he had been imprisoned for the past 7 years in Florida due to a felony firearms charge. He had just served the remainder of that prison sentence when Baldwin County detectives named him as their top suspect in Devin Kennedy's murder case. After his bond hearing that Friday, Judge Bill Scully set the bond amount at $150,000. Deputy Herring would be required to wear a GPS ankle monitor and be prohibited from leaving the state as part of the terms of his release if he were to successfully post bond. On April 15, 1997, a father and his 2 sons discovered a body in a secluded, dry stream bed close to the Morgan County line off Eagle Rock Road in Union Grove, Alabama. The skull, hands, and feet of the deceased individual had been removed on purpose, probably to hide his identity. Investigators suspect the man's heart and spleen may have contained evidence because they were also removed. According to forensic analysis, sharp-edge trauma was the cause of death. The gruesome efforts by the victim's killer or killers appeared to work because for years, investigators were unable to identify the victim. However, in 2019, Alabama authorities partnered with a DNA technology company named Parabon Nanolabs, which gradually made progress in the investigation by first enhancing and clarifying the DNA samples from the body and then comparing those profiles with others in genetic databases. Scientists from this company were able to create a genetic profile of the victim after overcoming DNA deterioration and bacterial contamination that had occurred over the course of the previous 26 years. They used DNA phenotyping to determine the physical characteristics of the victim. They later produced a composite sketch of the victim's profile which revealed a male whose age was between 20 and 28 years old. He was of North European descent, with a light or pale skin. He had blue eyes, brownish blonde hair, and few freckles. The investigators at the time released these sketches to the public in the hopes to get information, but no lead came out of it. In order to identify the victim, scientists at Parabon Nanolabs entered the body's DNA profile into public genealogical databases. Although they were able to pinpoint a few distant relatives of the body's DNA from the databases at their disposal, it took months to finally identify the victim. After finding further relatives and matching that information with historical records, the scientists were able to name the victim as 20 years old Jeffrey Douglas Kimsey of Santa Barbara. In 2023, investigators were able to track down a member of the Kimsey family in Tennessee, who then directed them to Kimsey's parents in Santa Barbara, California, where the identity was verified. Jeffrey Douglas's parents claimed they didn't know he was dead. He was never reported missing either. It isn't clear what he was doing in Alabama at the time of his murder, but investigators believed he was probably just passing by. Since Jeffrey Douglas Kimsey's case was ruled as a homicide, detectives are still on the case, trying to find his killer. They, however, announced having persons of interest in the case and are actively pursuing every lead and utilizing evidence gathered at the scene where the body was discovered. Hopefully, Jeffrey Douglas Kimsey gets justice soon.